Okay, so how do we begin to really apply this stuff to humans? Because it winds up being very pertinent in making sense of some of the most interesting, complex things about us. So, what's the difference between humans and every other species? Nothing all that exciting. From a neurobiological standpoint, you've got this real challenge, which is you look at a neuron from a fruit fly under a microscope, and you look at one from us, and it's going to look kind of the same. Looking at a single neuron, you can't tell which species it came from. We have the same kind of neurotransmitters that a worm uses in its nervous system. We've got the same kind of ion channels, the same sort of excitability, the same action potentials, minor details are different. We have not become humans by inventing new types of brain cells and new types of chemical messengers. We have the same basic off-the-rack neuron that a fly does. Oh, we have very similar basic building blocks. What's the difference, of course, is we've got 100 million of them for every neuron that you find in a fly brain. And out of that comes emergent properties. Great story. Garry Kasparov, I never remember which syllable to emphasize, grandmaster, Russian chess grandmaster in the 90s, and apparently he's rated as one of the strongest of all times. And he was the person who wound up participating in this really major event, which was this tournament with this chess-playing computer that IBM had built called Deep Blue, or Big Blue, or Old Yeller, or what was it called? Deep Blue. Deep Blue, and they played against each other, and apparently what happened was in the first game, Kasparov won perhaps, and the computer was able to modify its strategy and then proceeded to mop the floor with him. And this was a landmark event in computer science. This was the first time that a computer had beaten a chess grandmaster. Amazing event. Not surprisingly, afterward, Kasparov is all bummed out and depressed, and his friends were trying to make him feel better. And they go to him and they say, look, all you got done in by is quantity. All you got done in by is the fact that that computer could do a whole lot more computations than you could in a set amount of time. I'm told apparently chess grandmaster types can see 5, 6 moves ahead, and they can intuit where the interesting ones was. And Deep Blue could calculate every single possible outcome, like 7, 8 moves in advance, and every time it would simply pick the one that was the best outcome. It was like generating solutions to the traveling salesman problem. Kasparov didn't have a chance, because the computer could simply generate enough solutions to pick the right one. So all of them are saying to him, you should not be depressed, because all that computer had going for it was quantity. And what he said in response was, yeah, but with enough quantity, you invent quality. And that's the exact equivalent of 1 ant makes no sense and 10,000 do. That's the exact equivalent. With enough of these elements here, you optimize. We do not have fancy neurons that are different than in any other species. We've just got more of them. And simple nearest neighbor rules, and you throw, 1 million of them together and you get a fruit fly, and you throw 100 billion of them together and you get poetry, and you get symphonies, and you get theology, and you get all of that. And it's the same building blocks. With enough quantity, you invent quality. And this is the punchline that came out of really important work a few years ago. Okay, we're now, 10 years, I think, into having the human genome sequenced. And about 5 years ago, they sequenced the chimp genome. Soundbite everybody learned from whenever back when is that the human and chimp shares 98% of its DNA. So finally, you had these 2 gigantic rolls of printout, and here's the entire human genome, and here's the entire chimp one, and somebody could finally sit there and compare them and see, indeed, is it 98% shared? And that winds up being the answer, even though what that number actually means is debatable. But that brings up the question, of course, what's the 2%? What's the 2% that differ? And what has come out of that have been some very interesting findings. Some that were mentioned earlier on, which is they are disproportionately coding for transcription factors and splicing enzymes, and okay, that amplification of network stuff. It is preferentially coding for non-coding regions, differing but all the stuff from back that lecture for getting macroevolutionary changes, that's how you get a different species coming out. But how about other types of genes? What were some of the key differences? Here was one big difference. We have about 1,000 fewer genes for olfactory receptors than chimps do. They've been inactivated in us. They're called pseudogenes in us. They don't express, and that's about half of the difference in the genome between humans and chimps. If you want to turn a chimp into a human, you're halfway there if you just give it a lousy sense of smell. That's half the genetic differences. What other differences there? There were ones having to do with morphology, bone development, probably bipedalism versus being a partial quadruped. There was ones having to do with hair development, which is why chimps have all the hair on them and only those like disturbing people with the hair on their shoulders have that much hair. So there's differences in some reproductive related genes. You don't want to mate with them, all of that. And then you say, where's the genes having to do with the brain? Are there any differences there? And there turned out to be very, very few. And they turned out to be very, very logical. The handful that differ seem to have something to do with cell division. Have something to do with how many rounds of cell division these cells go through. And what you have is the human versions go through more rounds. And calculations have been done looking at the average number of neurons that each progenitor cell generates, say during cortical development. And if you start with the number of neurons that you find in a rhesus monkey brain and have it do 3 or 4 more rounds of cell division, you get a human brain in terms of the numbers. Qualitatively, it's the exact same neurons. All that differs is quantity, and you put enough of these together and you go from tools which are meant to get little termites out into human technology. The difference between us and them is one of quantity. Throw enough neurons in there and out begins emerging all these distinctive human things. So, what does that do? That begins to, for one thing, underline what the main genetics are about in terms of the genetic differences in the brain between us and, say, chimps, are genes that free you from genetic influences. Because those are not specifying what sort of cells you generate in larger numbers in the brain. They're not specifying connections. They're just specifying larger quantity. And all this stuff goes to work, and out comes a human brain instead of a chimp one.